Let us enter together into chapter 4 now of Curious Questions on the Meaning of Life with Qohelet. ושבתי אני אברא את כל העשוקים אשר נשים תחת השמש, והנה דמעת העשוקים, ואין להם מנחם, ומיד עוסקיהם כוח, ואין להם מנחם. ושבח אני את המתים שכבר מתו, מן החיים אשר המה חיים עדנה. וטוב משניהם את אשר עדן לא היה, אשר לא ראה את המעשה הרע, אשר נעשה תחת השמש. וראיתי אני את כל עמל, ואת כל כישרון המעשה, כי היא קנאת איש, מרעהו גם זה הבל ורות רוח. הכסיל חובק את ידיו ואוכל את בשרו, טוב לכף נחת, ימלוך אופניים עמל ורעות רוח. ושבתי אני ואראה הבל תחת השמש, יש אחד ואין שני, גם בין ואח אין לו, ואין קץ לעמלו, גם אינו לא תספע עושר. ולמי אני אמהל ומחסר את נפשי מטובה, גם זה הבל ועניין רע הוא. טובים השניים מן האחד אשר יש להם שכר טוב בעמלם, כי אם יפולו האחד יקים את חברו, ואילו האחד שיפול ואין שני להקימו. גם אם ישכבו שניים וחם להם ולאחד איך יחם, ואם יתקופו האחד, השניים יעמדו נגדו, והחוט המשולש לא במהרה ינתק. טוב ילד מסכן וחכם ממלך זקן וכסיל, אשר לא ידע להיזהר עוד, כי מבית אסורים יצא למלוך, כי גם במלכותו נולד רעש. ראיתי את כל החיים המהלכים תחת השמש, עם הילד השני אשר יעמוד תחתיו. אין קץ לכל העם, לכל אשר היה לפניהם, גם האחרונים לא ישמחו בו, כי גם זה הבל ורעיון רוח. שמור רגלך כאשר תלך אל בית האלוהים, וקרוב לשמוע מיתת הכסילים, זבח כי אינם יודעים לעשות רע. So, Marian, would you like to read for us your translation, chapter 4?
Okay. I further observed all the oppression that goes on under the sun, the tears of the oppressed with none to comfort them, and the power of their oppressors with none to comfort them. Then I accounted those who died long since more fortunate than those who are still living, and happier than either of those who have not yet come into being and have never witnessed the miseries that go on under the sun. I have also noticed that all labor and skillful enterprise come from men's envy of each other, another futility and pursuit of wind. True, the fool folds his hands together and has to eat his own flesh, but no less truly, better is a handful of gratification than 2 fists of labor, which is pursuit of wind. And I have noted this further futility under the sun. The case of the man who is alone, with no companion, who has neither son nor brother, yet he amasses wealth without limit, and his eye is never sated with riches. For whom now is he amassing it while denying himself enjoyment? That too is a futility and an unhappy business. 2 are better off than 1, in that they have greater benefit from their earnings. For should they fall, one can raise the other, but woe betide him who is alone and falls with no companion to raise him. Further, when 2 lie together, they are warm, but how can he who is alone get warm? Also, if one attacks, 2 can stand up to him. A 3-fold cord is not readily broken. Better a poor but wise youth than an old but foolish king who no longer has the sense to heed warnings. For the former can emerge from a dungeon to become king, while the latter, even if born to kingship, can become a pauper. However, I reflected about all the living who walk under the sun with that youthful successor who steps into his place. Unnumbered are the multitudes of all those who preceded them, and later generations will not acclaim him either, for that too is futile and pursuit of wind. Be not overeager to go to the house of God. More acceptable is obedience than the offering of fools, for they know nothing but to do wrong.
Thank you. So this is a very intriguing chapter. And if you're using JPS translation, there should be a few places at the bottom of the translation which admits the stupefaction that the translators have when they will say meaning of the Hebrew uncertain. That happens quite a lot in this chapter because it's not entirely clear to the translators what exactly is being articulated here. It's a very difficult chapter. And let's take a few observations and questions, and then I want to spend some time actually unpacking one of the stranger verses to see the way that, as I mentioned, the history of interpretation tries to come to terms with what this might mean, even if it is in many ways a misreading, a creative misreading against the contextual intention of the text. This is something we see a lot in the way the rabbis read scripture, and especially in terms of how the exegesis emerges. We've looked at a few different layers, and so each time we're going to look at a different way that the exegetical imagination works through these texts in surprising ways. But is there anything that you noticed either in your translation, the one that I've shared, just in terms of trying to clarify the pshat before we go into the next level, in terms of just what actually is being said on the contextual level with Qohelet here, because it is a very confusing chapter. Anything surprise you? Yeah, more?
I was struck that he talks about the futility of everything, but then he comes very close to saying that you're better off with people.
So that is a big surprise, right? That if you really, if it was the case, and that's the reason why we have to be careful with the translation, if everything is in chapter 1, verse 2, Hevel Havalim Hakol Hevel, go back and look at your translations now. Just keep reminding yourself, this is the key word to the whole book, is if everything is futile and everything is vain, then it leads to a sense of nihilism where life can either be absurd or meaningless, and it can lead to a sense that life is not worth living. Right? Some of the greatest philosophers, like Albert Camus, who I've been thinking about a lot during this time of the plague, talks about a kind of activism under a time of plague, and that even though things seem to be absurd or they seem to be cruel, or they lead us to a place of despair, we have to remain actively engaged in something that is meaningful. So Qohelet tried that, and remember we made the distinction between amalav and ma'asav. That is, there is a difference. Remember, Robert, we talked about that last week, the difference between what it is that I spend my life toiling over and for, in terms of my labor, as opposed to what it is that I'm able to do. What are the skillful means that I have to do something with whatever skills that I have to be able to make meaning of my life? And that's a difference between working and toiling, which has value, but is much more limited than the skillful means that I employ to make something of meaning of my life. And so there's that distinction. And now the question is that if life is hevel havalim, if it's vain, vanity of vanities, or utter futility, then why bother making friends, right? You've already decided that everything is meaningless, including other people. So you throw up your hands and, God forbid, you jump off the Decari or the Grand Canyon, you bury yourself alive because it leads you to suicidal thoughts, chas v'shalom. But that's not what Qohelet is actually saying. And if we don't look deeper into what he is saying, then we miss the genius of these observations, and they're sharp. And that is why Hevel Havalim cannot be translated, I think, responsibly as vanity of vanities or utter futility, because then it doesn't make sense. Why would you want to be in relationship with another? Why would you say, Um, verse 2 is difficult here in chapter 4, but let's just skip that for a moment. We'll come back to it. After looking at everything in the world, he decides, Qohelet decides, Tov Mishnehem. Sorry, he goes a little bit further, past for that verse 3, but friendship comes up later on that you pointed out, which is in verse 9, right? Tovim hashnayim min ha'echad asher yesh lahem schar tov ba'amalam, right? So it's not only that friendship has value. Here, it's first of all, it's a business venture, right? If you are trying to work and you have a project that you're laboring in, and you're trying to earn something, or you're engaged in a project, then ultimately you have to decide whether it's better to do it alone, to be an independent operator, or to have a partner. That's one way of reading it. But the ambiguity of this word amal that we talked about could mean earnings. And here, toil refers to life's endeavors and tribulations in general, and it's not just to occupational labors or their earnings. And so it's actually in addition to what we do in the world in terms of work, but actually making it through life oftentimes is easier when you have a friend, right? It's a very simple truth. Bev.
So going back to chapter 1 with vanity, so I have the sense that Qohelet is saying, okay, it may all be vanity, but you're born. And you have to put that aside and find your life path. And no matter what happens along the way, there will be good times and bad times. In chapter 4, you see some people get rich, good for them. Some people don't. Some people have friends, others don't.
Mm-hmm.
Some people are alone, others are not. You don't get to choose. You get a life path, and your job as a human being in God's earth is to make the best job of that before you get to the very end. And you get given a package and you're going to deal. It's not going to be equitable, but it's going to be what you've got.
Well, I would agree with you for a large part of what you said, but then the question is, isn't that a kind of fatalism?
Yeah.
You're given your package and you make the best of your lot. And I'm not sure that's what he's saying necessarily, because remember we spoke together when it occurred in the earlier chapters, the use of the word mikra, right? That it sometimes is translated as being your fate, but really it's what happens and how we respond rather than react to what happens to us in life. It's not always what happens isn't necessarily in our control. I agree with you, but it doesn't mean that we don't have the ability to be able to respond meaningfully. And I just want to make sure that when we're looking at things the way you describe them, that we don't fall into the sense of the package that we're given is our fate, and that we are consigned to a fate without any kind of free will. There still is human agency, Bev.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. You're given the package, but you have to strive to make it as good as you can or better. So you don't accept only what's given, but you make it better. So the person with a disability advocates for more rights for that disability.
Mm-hmm.
The person with a certain disease starts to fundraise for research to make that disease go away. So yeah, you get handed a package, but then you don't wait for it to unfold. You try to live within that as best you can and make it better.
They make it better. Okay. So that does give us agency, which I think is important. Okay. That's helpful. Thank you. Anyone else have a reaction to any of those pieces that we looked at? I mean, I think that when we look at verses 7 and 8, one of the things that that also is intriguing to think about is just the whole issue of labor, right? And verses 7 and 8 talk about the lone person's labor, right? Before we get into friendship, but there is this sense that to toil for Qohelet is always pointless, but for someone who is a loner, to toil thus compulsively and grimly without satisfaction actually is completely ridiculous according to Qohelet. It's an unhappy business is one of the ways, or a grievous business, right? It's an inyan ra, Qohelet says, because there's no one, at least no one that person cares about, to be able to enjoy what he or she hoards. Right, so it's the sad state of the loner that he's setting up here, is not accidental misfortune, but as one of the early French commentators, Rashi, observes, actually to be a loner is a chosen condition. So you may have your package, but Qohelet and Rashi's reading of it is actually, if you decide to be alone in life, that for some reason that is a chosen condition, because you choose to conduct your affairs alone. You don't take on a disciple who is like a son or a child, whether you have a biological child or not. From Rashi's perspective, and the way the rabbis are reading this is that you have to be willing to take on a disciple to teach Torah to that person, whatever it is that you learn. You must take on a disciple. You must find a companion for study who is like a brother or a sister, or a business partner, or a life partner who could be a helpmate. That's a chosen condition according to an early rabbinic interpretation. And so this idea of companionship then becomes one of the ways that you can take your package and your condition, and you can somehow begin the process of ameliorating it, as Bev was saying. And what's interesting is that this idea of being alone in the world, um, Soloveitchik has reflected on this in a number of places, but most famously in his essay, very famous essay called The Lonely Man of Faith. And he makes a distinction in terms of the existential condition of being alone and feeling lonely. Being alone and feeling lonely. You can walk into a room and feel lonely. You can be with other people and feel lonely. But the idea of being alone in many ways is the ultimate existential condition that Soloveitchik talks about, is our relationship with the divine, right? We always stand alone before God, even when we're in a community. And it's an interesting tension. He writes about that in an essay as well in 1978 called The Community, and then later on in The Lonely Man of Faith, that there is that tension between what does it mean to acknowledge that if you strip everything down to its core, we are radically alone in the face of the divine. And that doesn't, and that's even if we are with other people. And we can never deny that experience. But loneliness is something, as a feeling that comes and goes, and may be part of the context of how we live our lives. But that sense of being radically alone is not something that Soloveitchik sees as being problematic. He actually says this is what it means to be human, is to appreciate you have this unique, singular relationship alone before and with God. And that's something that has to be cultivated and something that has to be cherished. So now Qohelet, it's interesting to look at this, is also speaking about a situation where if you are alone in the world, or you decide to go and to live a lonely life, Ibn Ezra, one of the medieval commentators suggests that then you're really a fool. This is part of where the fool comes in, right? You're a fool for not taking a companion, because in this case, and it's very interesting to see what is the gender that is being suggested here of the companion. It's probably another adult male. So this is speaking about, it doesn't have to be this way. It can be read either way, but it seems as though, for example, if you're being attacked, that you would want to have someone else who is there to support you. And it may be the case that you can help fight off an attacker with someone who has strength that can complement your own. It doesn't necessarily have to be an adult male, but that seems to be what at least Ibn Ezra suggests is possible. And the sense of companionship, which is very interesting here, is that two companions can be together in the study of Torah, And then what is the third strand, right? Where it talks about now moving from 2 to 3, right? In verse 9. And then further on, it talks about in verse 12, right? Chuta meshulash lo bimhira yanatek. These are, who do you think the third is here? If we take the rabbinic approach, which is again very exegetical, it's suggesting it's a relationship of study. So the third in that relationship of study could be, who do you think?
God.
God, yeah.
That could be God. That's true, and or a teacher.
Or teacher, yeah.
A teacher, right? In a love relationship, the idea between two loving partners, between a lover and a beloved, is that the third in that relationship is God. But here, this is a relationship perhaps of study. It's not entirely clear, but the rabbis have to move very quickly. They want it to be related to Torah, right? That the Torah is the elixir of life, and they feel that if you decide to cut yourself off from Torah, from not only studying but then also being able to teach others, then there is no continuity after you. And that's something that is very important for Qohelet, is to be able to see, to point towards something beyond this life. And the threefold cord that is not readily broken. Also, if we agree with Qohelet that companionship of two people is beneficial, how much more so when you have the fellowship of three? And again, this is a cliche that was a common cliche in the world of wisdom sayings and pithy aphorisms, but Qohelet is weaving it into a very interesting mixture that emerges here. I want to take a turn for a moment, unless you have other questions, and I want to look at one other verse that I think is really quite strange, that needs some unpacking, to show you an extended exegesis on one verse in Qohelet that I found to be quite illuminating. So can we go to that for a moment?
Mm-hmm.
So we didn't talk about verse 2. Verse 2 is very strange. It says, "V'shabeach ani et hametim shekvar metu min hachayim asher hema chayim adena." Okay? So I praise the dead who have already died more than the living who are still alive. What could that possibly mean? What a strange thing to say. And if you look in your commentaries, and especially I think one of the great commentators and translators, Robert Alter, he just sees this as a redundancy. The seeming redundancy of the wording is a piece of Qohelet's pointed stylistic use of emphatic repetition, but that doesn't tell us what it means. That's the rhetoric. Yes, it is emphatic and it is redundant, but what is actually being said here? So any ideas before I share with you one way of reading it that I think is quite original and intriguing? Not necessarily contextual, it's more of an exegesis, but what would you do with this verse? How would you understand it?
So,
Bev?
you study Bible, this is not my opinion, but I'm reading from the notes underneath. It says, what is better? Oppression and evil can be so great that non-existence seems better than life.
So as a way of escaping oppression, which is the beginning of the opening verse, right? I returned and reconsidered all the oppression that's done under the sun, the tears of the oppressed who have none to console them, and from the hand of their violent oppressors there is none to console them. And so I praise the dead. That is to say, if you have died, then you have escaped oppression.
Right.
So that's one way of reading it. Link the two of them together. That could work. It seems highly pessimistic, and of course there is a very famous Rabbinic Controversy, machloket between Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai. They argued for 2.5 years over whether it is better that a human being is born or whether it is better not to be born. And this is part of where that comes from, right? It emerges from this debate, and then ultimately, how do you think they resolve the this disagreement? And then we'll get to your question, Marianne. Who do you think ultimately wins the debate? It's better not to be born, or it's better to be born?
It's better
to be born.
Right. So eventually Hillel overcomes Shammai and wins after 2.5 years of arguing, because the reality is that you're already born, so you can't change that. and you would never want to take your own life, God forbid. So now that you're born and that you exist, as you said, Bev, the perspective from the rabbis in this argument is it's better to do something meaningful and good with your life now that you're already here, even though, and notwithstanding the fact that there is oppression, that there is suffering, but you can do good and make a difference, right? That's a rabbinic retort to this idea that already is coming up here very strongly in Qohelet. Marian?
I was thinking about verse 2 in a different sort of context on something else I've been thinking about, but
Mm-hmm.
that there's this relationship in either in our imagination or in our spiritual life between the living and the dead, and the idea that if we give them permission, that the dead are still, in a sense, they're beyond us because they're flourishing in a way that we cannot flourish.
Mm-hmm.
And I had a friend who mentioned that she always sees her father, and every time she sees him, he's happier and happier. And
he's passed away?
Yes, and
Uh-huh.
he's not ageless. He's continuing to grow old.
So that's an interesting way to read it, and you're suggesting that that there is some possibility that Qohelet is already alluding to something beyond this life.
Yes, without a doubt.
Oh, without a doubt. Well, I'm not sure it's that entirely clear, but I think something is happening here. It's clear something is going on.
But then what made me think that is that the next verse, of course, is that they are happier. That it is happier than the condition they had when they were alive.
In verse 3?
Yes.
Uh-huh.
So they're happier than either those who have not yet come into being and have never witnessed the misery, so that somehow there's this context that they've had from life that allows them after life to be happier than they would have been before they were born.
Okay, so I think it's a great way to read it, and it's a very interesting observation that possibly could be part of what's going on here. It's a very obscure verse, but that is a possibility, and Qohelet doesn't really develop it in the rest of the chapters. It's not really explicated, but you're touching on something, Marian, that I wanted to turn to now, which I think is a very interesting way that to at least develop some exegesis. And what I've done now, and I'm going to share with you on the screen, is this passage that is explicated in a medieval text called the Zohar. Zohar is a mystical text in the on the Jewish bookshelf, and if you can see it now, it comes from just this one verse. So I praise the dead who have already died more than living who are still alive. Do you see that?
Yeah.
Okay. So what's interesting here is the Zohar. You have to ask the question, what's bothering Qohelet? And then you have to look at the commentators and say, what's bothering the commentators? And it seems like both Qohelet as well as the later commentaries are concerned about whether or not there is anything beyond this life, as Marian is suggesting. You're already seeing that within the text itself, that Qohelet is alluding to that, and the Zohar goes wild on this verse and says that there's a whole story that has to be unpacked here in terms of the afterlife. Now, that doesn't strike us as being within the purview of at least what's explicit in Qohelet, but it doesn't matter to the Zohar. The Zohar has an agenda, and part of the agenda of the Zohar, amidst many things that it discusses in its exegesis that's set up like a Torah commentary, is the afterlife and the journey of the soul. So let's take a moment to go into the world of the Zohar. This is a text which, even though it is ascribed to Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, whose yahrzeit in Hilula was on Lag BaOmer just a few days ago, in the 2nd century CE, the text itself was channeled and written down in the 13th century in Castile and Spain. So when I say that, that should also open up to you the vista of what's going on in terms of the world, other world religions theologically at that time, specifically the importance and the sophistication of Christian theology at the time. And the Jews of Spain who were living in the medieval period were in dialogue with and in competition with these competing theologies, both of Christianity and Islam, who had already developed some very complex ways of looking at the afterlife. And so Judaism has to respond in general, and specifically the Zohar is trying to respond in a meaningful way. So with that in mind, I want to take a look at this text. I'd like to read it all the way through and then unpack some of the pieces with you, and specifically look at this question of the afterlife that Marian brought up, and the question of the Garden of Eden, which just to draw your attention to it, remember when we're looking at verse 2, this whole exegesis we're going to look at now basically hinges on one word that appears twice. So you see in verse 2, it says Asher Hema Chaim Adena, that are still alive, and then it comes up again in verse 3, Et Asher Aden, okay, who had not yet seen. Do you see those two words?
Yeah.
Adena and Aden.
Yeah.
And if you are listening to the way it sounds, you already see where this could be going. But it sounds a lot like Eden, right? Which is Gan Eden. So watch the way that the Zohar works here, and we'll unpack it in a moment together. I'm reading from Danny Matt's marvelous translation. This is the third book of the Zohar, the third section, page 182a, the folio page. Rabbi Chia opened, so I praised the dead who have already died more than the living who are still alive. This verse has been discussed and established. Come and see. All the acts of the Blessed Holy One accord with justice and truth. No one can object to him or restrain the divine hand, saying, "What are you doing?" For God acts according to his will. So I praise the dead. You're going to notice now that the Zohar continues to go back to this verse and begins to parse it. Okay, V'shabeach ani et hametim. So I praise the dead. Now, is King Solomon actually praising the dead more than the living? Right? Already this sounds absurd to us. How is that possible? He's supposed to be wise. Look, one is called living only if he or she follows a path of truth in this world, as it is said in 2 Samuel, Benaiah, the son of Yehoiada, son of a living man, as has been established by the companions. The companions are this group, this mystical coterie around Shimon Bar Yochai, who were walking in a path of truth and interpreting scripture according to these mystical visions that they have. They go on to continue and say, well, a wicked person who does not follow a path of truth is actually called dead. And he praises the dead more than the living. If you're saying that that's the interpretation, then all the more so, how could Solomon be praising the dead more than the living? It just doesn't seem to compute, right? It's an ongoing conversation between the companions here. But surely all the words of Solomon were spoken in wisdom, as has been said, so I praise the dead. If nothing were written, I would agree. That is, if nothing more was written in that verse, I would agree with you. But here's the challenge. But since it is written, who have already died, another element appears in wisdom. And this section of the verse, who already have died, refers to another time, when they departed from the world and were rectified in the dust, given the opportunity to return to worldly life in order to be mended. Right? This is referring to, and we're going to unpack this in a moment together, the idea not just of the afterlife, but also of tikkun, of mending what goes on within one lifetime through reincarnation and the next and the next. After such a person's time is completed, he or she dies. Surely he or she is more praiseworthy than others who die. If you say he is judged another time in that world, look at what it is written. As Nahum the prophet teaches, distress does not arise twice. All the more so, since he or she has already received punishment once and twice. Surely his place is prepared more gloriously than that of the living who have not yet received punishment. So it plays a little bit on what Miriam was referring to, is that by moving into this next world, there is something that goes on in terms of a kind of spiritual evolution that's not possible while we're still in this world. So let's unpack it a little further, and then we'll come back and we'll take a look at how this exegesis is working. So it is written, so I praise the dead who have already died. These are living, yet they are called dead. Why are they called dead? Because they have already tasted the taste of death. And although they exist in this world, they are dead, having returned from the dead. Furthermore, they are poised to rectify previous deeds, that is to make a tikkun, to reincarnation, so they are called dead, more than the living who are still alive. Okay, going back again to parse this verse, who have not yet tasted the taste of death, nor received their punishment, and they do not know if they are worthy of that world or not. Now we're going to come back to this in a moment, but I want to take you just to the next section to see how everything is being unfolded here. Come and see. They're going to continue the conversation, just riffing on this verse and playing with it and unfolding it by juxtaposing it with a few other verses. Come and see the righteous who are worthy of being bound in the bundle of life, Tzorah Chaim, are privileged to see the supernal glory of the Holy King, as is said, Lachazot b'noam Hashem u'vacher v'heichalo, to gaze upon the beauty of God and to reflect in his palace. As for them, their abodes are finer and higher than the rungs of all holy angels, for neither those above nor below are worthy of seeing such a lofty abode, as is written, no eye has seen, O God, but you, what you will do for the one who awaits you. Those who are not worthy as these have an abode below, according to their conduct. They are not privileged to ascend to the place and to see those above, to see what those above see. They are stationed in lower Eden, no further. This is where the Zohar wanted to get to amidst all of this labyrinthine back and forth conversation. Now you might say, what is lower Eden, right? It sounded like Eden, Adena, remember? Now they're going into parsing out the architecture of the Garden of Eden. Well, this is lower Eden. Eden Tachton is the Eden called lower wisdom. It presides over the terrestrial garden, and the watchfulness of this Eden is upon it no further. These exist in this garden, delighting from this Eden. Now, what is the difference then between lower and higher Eden, which we're going to unpack in a moment, but let's listen to their conversation first. Look at what the Zohar does. The Zohar actually goes back to a verse that we already looked at in Ecclesiastes to try to make this point and to ground it in the text of Ecclesiastes. What is the difference between lower Eden and higher Eden? Like the advantage of light over darkness from chapter 2, verse 13. Lower Eden is called Edena, delight, feminine. Higher Eden is called Eden, delight, masculine. Of it is written, no eye has seen, O God, but you. This lower Eden is called garden in relation to the higher Eden, and this garden is called Eden in relation to the lower Eden. Those who are located in the lower garden delight from this Eden above them on every Shabbat and every Rosh Chodesh, as is written, from new moon to new moon, from Sabbath to Sabbath, all flesh shall come to bow down before me. Concerning these, Solomon said, more than the living who are Adena, still alive, for those others occupy a higher rung than these. Who are those? Those who have already died and received punishment twice. They are called refined silver that has entered fire once and twice, its dross expelled, now purified and cleansed. Now, when you look at that just for the first time through and you listen to what's going on, I'm sure everyone's head is spinning. And you're saying to yourself, first of all, what is the Zohar even talking about? And then, where on earth did the Zohar even come to find this in the text of Ecclesiastes? We could probably at least agree, yes, our heads are spinning, one, and two, that the pshat of the text of Qohelet does not necessarily support this reading. It's not what we would say move on me'elav. You read this and this would not be the first thing that you would see in verse 2 and 3. Am I right?
Right.
It takes a little bit of work to get there, and it's a bit of a stretch, which the Zohar loves to do, and in many ways is riffing on one, maybe two verses in Qohelet, one that's close to us, and then goes through a series of hermeneutic acrobatics that are really quite astonishing. Now, what I wanted to just focus on for a moment, and then we can talk about specific sections of this, because it's a very long and complex exegesis, but I want to talk about, for a moment, lower Eden and higher Eden. And again, try to appreciate in the 13th and 14th century already, what is one of the great works of literature that emerges in Italy that is already contemplating the architecture of paradise, of the inferno, and of and the purgatory.
Dante.
Dante's work.
Dante's Divina Commedia, right? The Divine Comedy. And there has been a lot of reflection on, it's hard to really know who was thinking what when, but there was clearly a lot of cross-pollination of ideas and the zeitgeist that was emerging during this period, that led to one of the greatest works of literature. Um, and we can debate whether that's the Zohar or the Divina Commedia, but both of them are beginning to imagine this journey of the soul in very, very complex ways. And the nuance that's being discussed here is really quite complex and nuanced. So just to give you a taste of what is going on here, the lower and higher Eden here um, are referring to different spheres of divine emanation. The Zohar sees the world and sees the journey of the soul through a matrix of 10 divine spheres of manifestation that are called sphirot, spheres or sphirot. In English, we would call them spheres. And so part of what is being outlined here is that through this journey of the soul that is able to return to its source. Remember, of course, that every soul is a fragment of the divine, right? We say every soul is a chelek Eloha mima'al. It is a fragment of and a portion of the great divine soul unto which it returns uh, upon death, right? That's already something that that we see in our burial practices, which are very ancient. We don't know how far this goes back when it was first inscribed on a tombstone, but what are the 5 letters of the Hebrew instant message on the bottom of most Jewish tombstones? Have you noticed before what's there?
Yeah. I don't know the Hebrew expression, but may bound up in the
Life eternal.
Right. It says Taf Nun Bet Tzadik He. Tehe Nishmato Tura Bitzror HaChaim. May
Right.
the soul be bound up in the bonds of life eternal. Now, that's something that already is the Zohar is referring to. If you recall, there was a reference to this bundle of life, that the righteous are worthy of being bound up in the bundle of life. And we have to ask ourselves as well, that's an expression that we use in our liturgy that has a lot of ancient resonance to it. And the Zohar is trying to unpack that, both liturgically, what does it mean when we say that at the time of Yizkor and at the time of a eulogy, which is a very ancient practice. What does it mean to be bound up in the bundle of life? And what does it also mean when we put it onto a tombstone? Here, the Zohar is suggesting that being bound up in the bundle of life really is that the soul is returning to the abode of beauty that's described in the book of Psalms 27:4. Lachazot benoam Adonai ulevaker beheichalo is not just the psalmist David yearning to be able to return to the temple in safety and to be able to dwell in the sanctuary all the days of his life. This is also a vision beyond escaping the oppressors and the enemies that are hounding the psalmist. This is a reflection, remember, um, of King Solomon, where King Solomon actually does build the temple and is able to have these these visions and this ability to be able to reflect on the supernal glory of the Holy King. And so what is created as a work of architecture below is reflected above. So the temple itself on the earth, the terrestrial temple is a reflection of the celestial temple. That's one of the things already that begins to happen. You see it a lot in the Zohar, as above, so below, right? There's a divine blueprint or matrix that's reflected in the terrestrial matrix. And so the Zohar is beginning to play with that and to suggest that there is a place where these souls return to gaze upon the beauty of God and to reflect in the palace. That is when the righteous leave this world, their souls emerge from this world and they ascend into this celestial temple. But of course, to be able to get to that lofty abode, no eye has seen, O God, but you, what you will do for the one who awaits you. So there is this ability for us to be able to begin to imagine that there is an ascent of the soul. And that ascent goes through rungs, it goes through stages. And here, part of what Lower Eden and Upper Eden are referring to are spheres along that journey to the return to the ultimate experience of returning to the source from which the soul came, which is in God. Okay, so that goes through some of the technical mappings of that. We're not going to go into it now, but I wanted to just to bring it to your attention that there is this movement that is a process of ascent, and that on holy days, that souls inhabiting the terrestrial garden bask in light that issues from above, from the higher Eden. And so there's this understanding, and it's a beautiful melding together of verses from Isaiah that this passage from Isaiah 66 is brought forward, right? From new moon to new moon, from Sabbath to Sabbath, all flesh shall come to bow down before me. And there is this, within the exegetical imagination, there is this experience that's being described here of the souls that are coming to rejoice. And in other sections, it speaks about this in very powerful terms. This description of souls that are rejoicing during the holidays and during the Sabbath as a time of reunion. It's a time of great delight. God delights in these moments because this is the time when the souls that are wrapped up in the bundle of life are rejoicing and giving pleasure to God. And that's the reason why below here, these souls that we are also rejoice on Sabbath and on the holidays, because there is a story of our souls that's intertwined with souls from beyond that are connected to the souls that are here. Now, that is not part of, I think, what the contextual meaning of Qohelet is describing. I think the Zohar is building a massive edifice of the idea of and the experience of the afterlife that people are yearning for already. Listeners during the biblical period are wondering, is this all there is? And Qohelet is at least alluding to the possibility that there's something more without explicitly articulating it. I think what the Zohar is doing that's so fascinating is beginning to paint this this picture from the palette of verses that we've seen. It's a palette of extreme paucity, because there's really only 2 verses in Qohelet the Zohar is using to construct these monumental palaces. But it's a very interesting way of looking at the journey of the soul specifically. And then, of course, everything hangs on the way that you read and you misread that one word, Adena, Eden, right? Adena and Edna, this idea of delight, which is in Qohelet, is that are still alive. This is still the souls who have already died and been reincarnated in the higher Garden of Eden, having twice endured the purging punishment of death. There is this idea that there is something more. There is a process of reincarnation, and through that process, the soul is purified. And the image here is really quite powerful and immediate. They are called refined silver. Having entered the fire once and twice, the dross that covers the soul is expelled, and now it is considered to be purified and cleansed. And that is something that the Zohar believes is a process of this ascent of the soul. That the soul has the capacity to be able to ascend. It's spoken about in other areas as well, building on the vision in the book of Daniel of the Nahar Dinur, that is the river of fire, that the souls have to be dipped into this fire once or twice, and in that process, the dross is expelled from the soul, and it's able to make its complete ascent into these different levels of the Garden of Eden. So that's a lot for us to absorb right now, I'm sure, but let's reflect on it for a few moments. If you have any questions on this specific exegesis that's done by the Zohar, or the rest of the chapter that we've looked at together. Marian.
I don't know why I keep sticking, the Sephirot. This always happens to me, and I know it's a problem of imagination, probably, that I'm fine with the concept of the ascent.
Mm-hmm.
But But the levels, when you start to, it feels like there's, as soon as you talk about levels, it feels like there's closing of doors and opening of doors. And it feels disjunctive. It doesn't feel realistic. It doesn't, not realistic, but it doesn't feel right.
Mm-hmm.
It feels, I don't know. Is that coherent?
Does it feel, it doesn't feel dynamic enough, or does it feel that it just feels awkward to you?
It feels awkward, and I think it feels awkward because it has a sense of, as soon as you, the ascent is fine, but as soon as you recognize the levels, or that, then it feels like a process that is, I don't know how to. It feels like doors opening and closing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
The opening is fine, but the closing is, I don't know how to say it.
I think I understand what you mean. And again, this is the work of the imagination, because um, by and large, most of us have not had conversations with people who have come back, or souls that have come back from this experience. So the Zohar, apparently, the circle of the Zohar, this group of these mystics, have had this vision, and this is where the vision comes from, and they see themselves as being able to be in conversation with those souls. That's not something that we would say is a normative experience of most Jews, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Far from it. So it strikes us as strange to begin with, and then to try to imagine this kind of divine architecture is even stranger. And one of the dangers of engaging in this kind of imaginative practice is, as you say, is that it becomes, once it becomes reified and it loses its dynamism, then what is being the gift of the imagination is lost. So if there are places, I mean, there, it doesn't actually speak of doors here. So that's something I think it's interesting. Your mind is already projecting that into the image that the imaginal, vision that is being projected here. But it's also ambiguous, and our minds are trying. Like, this is one of the things that happens with Zoom as well. They've done neurobiological studies, and they see that because um, the way that Zoom works is that there's latency and there's gaps between the images, and between, especially with the sounds when you speak or when you try to sing. Our brain is naturally wired to fill in those gaps. And so even with this kind of, and all the more so with a grandiose imaginal vision like this, our brains are trying to figure out, how does this work? How does the architecture really work? And part of it is that we have to let go of the need to be able to reify the image. And yet, the imagery that's being used here is very provocative. But I think that this is where, and what's interesting, it's a topic for a different conversation, where it's interesting to look at how exegesis works when we're interpreting scripture, and specifically what part of the human faculties are being engaged, right? When we read scripture on a pshat level, on the contextual level, by and large, what part of your faculties is it engaging, for the most part?
It's just a simple faculty of narrative with very little imagination, really.
Right, and which means that it's mostly the mind, right? It's the rational mind that's working through, and we're going through the exercise of trying to figure out, what does the text mean on its own terms? If there's a narrative, how do you sort of just unpack what the narrative looks like? There's a beginning, there's a middle, there's an end, there's characters in a story, but it's within the realm of our experience. There are other ways of looking, and remember, we talk about interpreting scripture on at least 4 levels, and the Zohar is operating with this as well, the 4 levels of what's called pardes, which means, which also is another name for the Garden of Eden, of paradise. But pardes is 4 letters: Pei, Resh, Daled, and Samech. Pei stands for Pshat. That is, what is the contextual meaning of the verse, which we're spending a lot of time working on together. The next level, Resh, of interpretation, is called Remez. What is the elusive meaning, or sometimes is known as the philosophical meaning? Daled, and it doesn't always go in this order, but Daled sometimes is before Resh. Daled is Drash, which is the homiletical meaning, right? In the idea of midrash, or of the exegesis that is being described. And then the final level of samech is called sod. It's the secret meaning. And so what the Zohar already assumes is that we've gone through, that the reader has gone through the first three levels of interpretation of pshat, remez, and drash. You've established the contextual meaning of the verses that we're looking at. You understand the philosophical allusions as well as the exegesis that the rabbis have made on these verses. And then comes the layer, this accretion. All these accretions are brought together to accumulate into what they call the secret meaning of the text. And the secret meaning is an esoteric reading of the text, which for some people works, and for other people it leaves them stupefied. And it's just what I wanted to show you today was one of the other levels that's operating while we're going through the level of pshat. There is also a level of sod that is also working at all times. That is, even though scripture itself that we read in the Hebrew Bible is an exoteric text, there are esoteric levels of meaning with every verse and with every word. And so it's important to be exposed to that beauty and to realize that it's there. And as we go through the rest of Qohelet, we're going to return back to the pshat when we go to chapter 5. But I wanted to show you one of the interpretive mechanisms that is at play when we go through these remarkable words and we grapple with the meaning of life. And when Qohelet grapples with the meaning of life and existence, Qohelet is grappling with both life within this world and, according to the Zohar, life beyond this world. And I think that's an interesting way for us to continue this journey through the curious questions that Qohelet asks, and also to see how those curious questions resonate through generations of interpretation. And some of those interpretive layers may resonate with you more, some less, but it's important to appreciate as readers and lovers of Judaism and of Scripture, how these texts have been received and read and interpreted and lived from generation to generation. And that, from my perspective, I think is really, really an incredible gift for us to consider and to contemplate together. So with that, we're going to conclude today's session, and next week we'll continue with chapter 5. So thank you.
Yashikor.